My name is Rika Toribio. I'm the Senior Director of Enrollment Management here at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And we are really pleased that you can join us today for our webinar on the Alchemical Apocalypse, the myth of our time. And this is presented to you by the chair of our Mythological Studies program, Dr. Evans Lansing Smith, who will be, again, presenting to you. And then afterwards, around 3:50 for the last 10 minutes, we will have, we'll give you the opportunity to ask Dr. Lansing Smith some questions. And for those questions, which I will remind you again later, you can post those on the Q&A section off the bottom of your screen. So again, that'll be in the last 10 minutes, but without further ado, Dr. Lansing Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Rika, and thank you all for participating. We'll circle back to the end when I'll turn off the PowerPoint and speak to you directly with a spectacular picture of myself in my home office here in Carpinteria. So people often ask me, what is the myth that we are living by? And it's become very clear to me that we are living the myth of the apocalypse. And this does not necessarily mean the complete end of everything, the end of the world. But it does mean a radical transformation is in process. And it's an alchemical transformation in the sense that the basic metaphors of alchemy have to do with the reduction of molecular compounds to their elements so that those elements can be recombined in order to create new and original substances. And in alchemy, the whole process moves towards the creation of something called the philosopher's stone. So if we take that basic metaphor of any large structure which decomposes, which disintegrates, which falls apart and collapses, we have an alchemical apocalypse at work. And clearly this is the case today, when all of our social and political and religious, financial, economic structures are disintegrating and collapsing in a process of a reduction to their elements. The myth tells us that that's not the end of the story, that after the dissolution of the forms, there will come a renewal, process of reconstruction and regeneration. So that this is the basic dynamic of the mythologies of both alchemy and the apocalypse. And when I say apocalypse, I am going to refer to the biblical book of Revelation, the one that is most familiar to the European culture. And some of the things that I will offer come from a wonderful book by D.H. Lawrence called Apocalypse, D.H. Lawrence's last book, which develops a mythological approach to the subject. I should say briefly that this slide shows you an overview of the curriculum in the Mythological Studies program, which involves fundamentally the mythologies of the different cultural traditions from as many cultures as we can manage to get into the schedule. And it also involves, however, more specialized kinds of classes, like the one I teach on alchemy and Hermeticism. And this is where this presentation would fall into that particular category. I should also say that in addition to the multicultural foundation of the program, that my approach to teaching and that of the rest of the other faculty members is transdisciplinary in the sense that mythological studies embraces many of the different disciplines associated with the humanities and with the liberal arts. And I'd like to give you some feeling about how that goes with the presentation today. And very quickly say something about this PowerPoint slide, and you'll see in the center the focus on myth. Myth as a place of origins that informs all of the other disciplines that emerged from it. Art, literature, theology, philosophy, music, psychology. Elements of all of these disciplines is a very, very important part of the way the classes are taught in the myth program, which is a transdisciplinary multicultural program that is informed by the traditions of depth psychology with Jung and Freud and Hillman, but it is not dominated by them. If this were one of the other programs at Pacifica, we would change this PowerPoint to put psychology in the center and myth as a subcategory, you see. But for the myth program, obviously, psychology is a subcategory of the central focus on myth from a transdisciplinary point of view. And I'd like to give you some sense of that as we begin to explore the mythology of the apocalypse and its representations in art and literature. This is a page from a series of engravings by Albrecht Durer from the 16th century called The Apocalypse with Figures, Apocalypsis cum Figuris. And it shows you images derived from the book of Revelation. And as you might imagine, they've been the Revelation has been widely treated in the art historical context. So a quick kind of introduction to the terminology that connects the apocalypse to alchemy. We should begin with the word apocalypse itself, which literally means something like uncover or unveil. To unveil or uncover something which has been obscured or covered over. And the word for covering, kalupto, is a cognate with the word in the Odyssey for Calypso, the island of Calypso, where Odysseus is covered, so to speak, hidden for a 7-year period. The apocalypse and alchemy share some basic ideas. One is, as I mentioned, the reduction to the elements, large compounds that are dissolved, destroyed, reduced to their elements so that new forms can be created. And in the context of the myth of apocalypse, this often involves what we call ricorso, circling back to the beginning of time, to the origins at the end of time, for the purposes of revelation and renewal. And this process typically involves, particularly in the biblical book of Revelation, the notion of polemos, a conflict between opposites, such as the one that we see unfolding in front of us with the House versus the Senate and the Democrats versus the Republicans. In the Bible, it is a conflict between God and the angels and the rebel angels led by Satan or the Antichrist. This is an outline of a course I could teach. You know, if we had time to focus on the literary works, many of them from the time of the Second World War, from about 1938 to 46 or so, the time when you can imagine the mythology of apocalypse would be even more in people's minds than it is today, although the COVID is rivaling the catastrophic tragedy of the Second World War in terms of the numbers. And these are all terrific works of literature, long, challenging, and they include films like Ingmar Bergman's Seventh Seal, so that one can imagine teaching a transdisciplinary course which would include literature and film, focusing on the apocalypse, and it would be abundantly illustrated by images from art history. This is my version of the Red Letter Bible. And it simply shows you some very, very important details from the actual text of Revelation. Perhaps the most important is the quotation that begins and ends Revelation, when Jesus says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the ending, which is, which was, and which is to come, uniting the opposites of the beginning and the end. Then there's this elaboration that brings into the mythology of the book of Revelation the myth of the descent to the underworld, which is D.H. Lawrence's contribution to the conversation. Essentially argues that what happens in Revelation is a descent to and a return from the underworld. So it's interesting here that at the beginning of the book, Christ says that he has the keys of hell and of death, suggesting a doorway and the mythology of a journey through the underworld, followed by a resurrection and a return. Other details of the imagery here is important for the paintings that we're going to look at, with the 7 stars that are in front of or in the right hand of Christ, and represented by 7 golden candlesticks in front of him. And then the throne itself that Christ sits upon is described using language that's very close to that of the philosopher's stone in alchemy. In this case, the stone is our jasper and sardine stone. And then around about the throne, there is a rainbow that is like unto an emerald. Now, the emerald is one of the most widely distributed symbols of the philosopher's stone that we have. In fact, the very first alchemical text in the Hellenistic era is called the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus. So the emerald itself is a symbol of the philosopher's stone, which is the ultimate goal of alchemical transformation. The passages continue to add details to this image of Christ seated on the rainbow with the 7 candlesticks, surrounded by 24 elders who are wearing crowns of gold. And then the final important detail are the great symbols of what the text calls the 4 beasts full of eyes that sit around the throne. These, of course, are the lion, the ox, the man, and the eagle. And here in Revelation, they're simply called beasts. They will come, of course, in the tradition to be identified with the 4 evangelists. So if we take all of that together, we get some very, very powerful archetypal images of great importance from the point of view of comparative mythology, and a very, very long, long tradition of artistic representations of the book of Revelation. This one, for example, is an Anglo-Norman illuminated manuscript from the 12th century. And it shows John on the island of his exile, Patmos, and he is communicating with an angel who is instructing him to write down in a book what he sees unfolding in the heavens. This is a very important part of the text. It shows us that the mythology of the apocalypse has something to do with reading and writing. A mythology, an archetypal mythology of reading and writing, because John is reading a book that he sees in the heavens, and at the same time he's writing a book. So that this becomes a kind of analogy or a myth for the creative mysteries involved in reading and writing. And they, of course, both involve a revelation of some kind, an uncovering, an unveiling of something that's been hidden. So you'll often see these wonderful images moving now up into the late Middle Ages, into the Renaissance. You'll see this image of John writing the book, and he is observing the unfolding of the apocalyptic events in the heavens above him. This is a French book, The Very Rich Hours of the Dukes of Berry, that shows the image of John with his little pet eagle with him, who is rather adorably holding on to an ink pot and a place to put his pen after he's finished writing. And you'll notice that on the lap of Christ, on his throne, surrounded by the elders, you'll see the famous image of the book with 7 seals and the Lamb who's going to open the pages by breaking the seals of the book. Now, the candlesticks and the stars are one of the things that D.H. Lawrence writes about in his commentary on the Book of Apocalypse. Traditionally, the candlesticks are associated with the 7 churches of the ancient world. But Lawrence doesn't care much for allegory. He's more interested in the mythologies of the Mediterranean world. So that for Lawrence, the 7 candlesticks represent the 7 celestial bodies of the planets, and they revolve around the central Lord of the cosmos, which he calls the Cosmocrator, the Lord of the cosmos, or the image of the dynamism. The energy and the form are represented by Christ, sitting in the center with the 7 stars and associated with the planets. Now, this is an image that goes all the way through the artistic tradition, and you'll see here a very early Russian iconographic depiction of Christ with the stars and the candlesticks. Moving into the European Middle Ages in the 12th century, this is kind of the characteristic image that one will see with alchemical resonance. And it's also one that Lawrence writes about in his analysis of the imagery. Here you'll see Christ seated on the throne, surrounded by a rainbow and the 4 beasts of the apocalypse, which Lawrence associates with the signs of the zodiac, and the notion that Christ sits in the center of the cosmos. And these symbols of the candlesticks and the rainbow, as we'll see, often always have alchemical resonance as well. And this becomes then a characteristic motif of Christ in the book, seated on his throne, surrounded by the 4 beasts and the symbolism of the book. This is Albrecht Durer's image of Christ with the sword of the Logos, the stars in his hand, and the 7 candlesticks with John kneeling at his feet. And another image from Albrecht Durer, whose engravings are spectacular. This one's a little hard to see, but there's the special image of the ram with the 7 horns that breaks the 7 seals of the book. This is William Blake's profoundly imaginal portrayal of Christ on the throne. And you'll notice his book here has the 7 seals that will be broken. And down here is Blake's version of the 7 candlesticks in front of the throne. Now, the alchemical imagery here is very suggestive. And it relates to the alchemical problem of the squaring of the circle and the symbolism of the rainbow itself, and the symbolism of the philosopher's stone, all of which are important in the alchemical traditions. And it's important to remember that the book of Revelation was written 200 AD or so, 200 to 250. And this is the time when the first Hermetic texts were being widely promulgated in the ancient world. So it's not out of the question that this tradition is a part of the conception of St. John's Apocalypse. So, for example, if you think of Christ seated on the rainbow, surrounded by the 4 beasts, you have the squaring of the circle. And this is a text that I teach in the alchemy class, of Hermes Trismegistus with his beautiful robe on the left, using the compass to square the circle, which involves the use of a triangle. And this gives a mythical geometry connected to the alchemical traditions, where the square represents the earth, the circle represents the heavens, and the movement back and forth is effected by the triangle, here an upward pointed triangle inscribed within a circle. And the squaring of the circle has to do with the creation of the philosopher's stone, which in the tradition will come to be associated with the risen Christ of the book of Revelation. So in the art historical traditions of the representations of the Bible, you'll see this very famous book of Kells from the island of Iona off the coast of Scotland, now of course in the Trinity College Library in Dublin. And it shows the symbolism of the four beasts here, with the eagle, the man, the ox, and the lion, by this time clearly associated with the four evangelists. And they surround the central symbol of the cross to produce what Jung would call a mandala, a symbol of wholeness within the self. And of course, for Jung, alchemy was an analogy for the individuation process of moving towards the creation of a new self, a new identity that comes out of the disintegration and the collapse of the old identity. It's a problem that drives people into analysis. Something falls apart professionally, in relationships, physical health, and these are the things that drive us into the analytical sessions. And the process is the one of forging a new identity that comes out of the collapse of the previous persona. Now, the image of the peacock is important because in alchemy, the tail of the peacock is represented by the rainbow. It's a sudden exfoliation of color within the alchemical vessel, which indicates that we are moving towards the completion of the alchemical opus of transformation, just before its final conclusion with the generation of the philosopher's stone, represented in the tradition by the risen Christ. So this is one of those gorgeous books that I teach in the course on alchemy and hermeticism, called The Splendor Solis, which has a series of plates that are quite spectacular, illustrating the alchemical process. And in this one, you'll see the peacock, the cauda pavonis is the tail of the peacock, and various symbols of the signs of the zodiac with the activities associated with the seasons in the marginalia. Now, this symbol of the peacock appears in the iconography of Christian art of the Renaissance, such as in this painting by Jan van Eyck, whose paintings are a goldmine for students of comparative mythology, and often of alchemy as well. So here is a picture of the Virgin Mary on the right, the patron who's paid for the painting on the left, reading his Bible, and just here, above the Bible, back in this little niche, is a peacock, which you'll see here. And in these paintings of Van Eyck, everything has a symbolic significance with reference to the iconographies of the Bible and the basic teachings of Christianity. So you'll see here the peacock becomes an important symbol connected to Christian iconography, but one also finds the peacock in Oriental arts. And it's important to note that our curriculum at Pacifica in the Myth program covers several of the most important Oriental traditions: Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, Egyptian mythology, just to name a few. And in that context, the peacock represents the stars of the night sky. With eyes in the tail of the peacock are the stars. In other words, an image of the grandeur and the beauty of the cosmos. In Christianity, the peacock comes to be associated with Christ because its mythology was that the flesh of the peacock does not decompose, and therefore lent itself to the iconography of Christianity. Now, if we're thinking about the mandala and the symbolism of the rainbow, we could explore how those basic archetypal structures manifest themselves in other cultures, such as, for example, the Tibetan tankas in the Buddhist traditions of Tibet. And you'll see here an image of one of the Buddhas of the heavens, seated on a throne, surrounded by a rainbow, very, very close to the iconography of St. John's Revelation. At the bottom of the image, you'll see the souls coming up from the sea of the material world, being greeted by a guardian to the heavens of the Buddhas that you'll see here with the little guardian, has his hand on the head of one of those souls who is ascending into the heavens all along the path of the rainbow. Those of you who know Wagner and the opera The Rheingold, you'll remember that the rainbow bridge is called the Bifrost, and it leads the gods into their version of the heavenly palace, and that would be the palace, the Hall of Valhalla. So this is a good example of the mandala symbolism from the point of view of comparative mythology as a symbol of what Jung would call the wholeness of the self and the ultimate destination of the analytical process. Now, we have limited time today, so I'm not going to go through all of the catastrophes that unfold with the destruction of the world in the book of Revelation. And they, of course, involve what happens when the 7 seals of the book on the lap of Christ is broken. And with the breaking of every seal, there comes another catastrophe on the earth. And these are described in vivid details. They are then followed by the blowing of the 7 trumpets. And that, in turn, unleashes the sequence of catastrophes, leading to the complete destruction of the world, which, from an alchemical point of view, has to happen before there can be any radical transformation. It's essential to the whole process. There can be no life without death, the basic fact of our existence. And this is very important in a reading of the biblical book of Apocalypse. Now, I've chosen the 6th seal here because the symbolism of the sun and the moon comes into this piece, where the sun becomes black as sackcloth and the moon becomes like blood. Now, this image of the eclipse or the black sun is very important in alchemy for a particular moment in the process of alchemical transformation. Here is an Anglo-Norman illuminated manuscript from the 12th century that shows this very important theme, both in alchemy and in the mythology of Apocalypse, having to do with the relationship between the solar and the lunar principles. In Jung, in his studies in alchemy, this would be referred to as the mysterium conjunctionis, the conjunction of opposites represented by the solar king and the lunar queen, and the relationship between them as a central symbol of the alchemical marriage. So you'll see here that the illustrator has included that very beautifully in the upper left. And he's also included the image of the darkening of the sun, a kind of eclipse in progress, which of course an eclipse involves the synthesis or synchronicity of the cycles of both the sun and the moon, and therefore an interesting symbol of their union. And Albrecht Durer's image of the breaking of the sixth seal and the falling of the stars also includes the imagery of the solar and the lunar cycles, which you see in his engravings of the crucifixion as well. Now, one of the images from another text that I teach in the alchemy class focuses on the stage of the alchemical operation called the putrefactio, the negredo, the death and complete disintegration of the substance in the alchemical vessel. Here represented by death as a skeleton with the crow in the upward pointed right limb, and then the downward pointed left limb. That's an important mudra, uniting the heavens and the earth. In the upper left and right, you'll see the symbols of the solar and the lunar conjunction, and the skeleton is standing on the black sun as an important symbol of the conjunction of the solar and the lunar cycles. Now again, this is stuff that has to happen. Things have to fall apart before there can be any positive creative change. And of course, that's what we're witnessing on a daily basis today. This is a text from the Rosicrucian period, Robert Fludd, the English Hermetic philosopher of the Black Sun. And this one is Arabic, from a book by Ibn Umayl, a visionary Arabic Hermetic philosopher in the Islamic tradition, clearly uniting the alchemical colors of white, black, and gold, and to yield this powerful image of eclipse related to alchemical transformation. Now, after the blowing of the trumps and the breaking of the seals, there's an interlude when 4 angels are seen standing on the 4 corners of the earth. And this is an image of the squaring of the circle. And it is dramatically presented in a very famous poem by John Donne, one of the holy sonnets from late in his life. At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls, and to your scattered bodies go. And then it proceeds to follow the form of the sonnet. But that very first line, at the round earth's imagined corners, gives us the image of the squaring of the circle related to the iconography from the Book of Revelation. And we know, of course, that John Donne was very impacted by the Hermetic philosophies of alchemy in his early poetry. In fact, there's one that's simply called Love's Alchemy. So that the English Renaissance literature becomes an important part of the class that I teach on alchemy and Hermeticism. So we have just a little bit of time left, and if this were the classroom, I'd be able to pause for questions and commentary, but it's unfortunately not the classroom. But I want to turn from the image of Christ seated on the rainbow and the imagery of the breaking of the seals and the alchemical associations to another very famous image from the Book of Revelation that has alchemical and comparative mythological significance. And that's the image of the woman clothed in the radiance of the sun, who of course is the Virgin Mary, the great wonder in heaven. And she's got the moon under her feet. There's a crown of 12 stars on her head, and she is in labor. She is delivering. And she is clothed in the radiance of the sun. Now, I'd like briefly to amplify some of these images that have to do with the symbolism of the sun and the moon and the stars, and also with the very powerful mythological motif of the relationship between the dragon and the feminine. So here is Albrecht Dürer's image of the woman clothed in the radiance of the sun, sitting on the crescent moon with the coronal of stars behind her. And the ultimate goal of alchemy, as I've mentioned before, involves the mysterium conjunctionis, the mystical marriage of the solar king and the lunar queen, the silver and the gold. And that represents the climactic moment of the alchemical process of transformation. And this is exactly what we see in this image of the divine feminine, uniting the iconography of the sun, the moon, and the stars. This is from one of the stained glass windows in Chartres, where I took a trip, the Mythological Studies tour last year, and was planning another one in a series focused on the Grail romances. But clearly, all of those trips are on hiatus right now with the situation we're facing, where Americans can't even travel to Europe because we have such a bad record with tending to the virus. So there aren't going to be any Mythological Studies tours next year, but there will be in the years to come. And when we do that, this is the wonderful stained glass window of Chartres, and it shows the Virgin Mary clothed in the radiance of the sun, seated on the crescent moon with a coronal of stars. And Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, which makes it easier to see the coronal of stars represented by the gemstones, which are alchemical symbols in the crown that she's wearing while she's reading a book. The union of the sun and the moon, as I mentioned, is a fundamental theme in alchemy, such as in this text called the Rosarium Philosophorum from about 1550, a text that Jung offered substantial commentary on in his book on the psychology of the transference. And it shows you the union of the solar king and the lunar queen, symbolic of the alchemical marriage of opposites. This is a more spectacular image from the Splendor Solis, and it shows you the image of the king and the queen, and standing on the sun and the moon, and wonderful images of the lunar and the solar cycles above them, representing the completion of the alchemical opus. Now, our woman clothed in the radiance of the sun is being pursued by a dragon with 7 heads, 10 horns, and so forth. And his tail is drawing down a third part of the stars in the heavens and casting them to the earth. And he's chasing the woman to devour her child. Now, Lawrence points out in his book that the woman clothed in the radiance of the sun, and later on the Scarlet Whore of Babylon, are both manifestations of the traditions of the great goddesses of the ancient Mediterranean world. And they are often in alchemy associated with the symbolism of the dragon. And you'll see here a very early image of the woman standing on the moon, pursued by the dragon. And then a later Renaissance image, it's a little bit more clear, clothed in the radiance of the sun, standing on the crescent moon with the dragon in hot pursuit while the disasters unfold on the earth below. A motif that was widely represented in the art historical traditions of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, with 1,001 variations on the iconography. Back to Albrecht Dürer's picture of a rather terrific dragon with 7 heads and the Virgin on the crescent moon. William Blake's visionary paintings of the apocalypse are quite extraordinary, as you can see here, with the woman pursued by the dragon. And these have alchemical manifestations. Very famously in this book by Michael Meyer, called Antilatafugians, which shows us here the 50th of 50 emblems, which includes a poem in Latin with an image, a hieroglyphic image, representing an aspect of the alchemical processes of transformation. And here is the woman in a grave being embraced by the dragon. And here a variation on the symbolism of the dragon, this time with 3 heads, with the symbolism of the hermaphrodite above, uniting the solar and the lunar principles. Again, from the Rosarium Philosophorum, representing the completion of the alchemical opus of transformation. One could pursue this image of the dragon for the rest of the day if we had time, particularly the iconography of the slaying of the dragon to rescue or liberate the feminine principle of the soul that is imprisoned in the material world and needs to be released and redeemed. Another very famous alchemical image by Robert Flood, and it shows us an image in the center very close to the Book of Revelation with the solar and the lunar symbols on her body, the carnal of stars, and connecting the heavens with the earth. It's an image that Joseph Campbell says is not only related to the biblical Book of Revelation, but also to the image of Isis in a book by Apuleius called The Golden Ass, which is part of our curriculum in the courses on Greco-Roman mythology, where Isis appears to the hero Lucius in the form of a dream vision. This is Mozart's Magic Flute, an early production that shows us the Queen of the Night with the stars of the cosmos standing on the crescent moon. And of course, the Magic Flute is Mozart's Masonic opera, the one most informed by the traditions of Hermetic alchemy, with the initiation rites of the Freemasons. If we had time, we could just take a break and listen to all of Mozart's Magic Flute. And in the classroom, of course, we can do a little bit of that with the films and the music of the opera. Now we're coming up close to our conclusion. There are several more images that we could explore related to alchemy and the apocalypse. I'm going to go forward quite quickly beyond the Scarlet Whore of Babylon to finish with the image of the heavenly city descending from above. And this is the image that after everything is destroyed, all the trumpets have been blown and all the seals of the book have been broken, and there are plagues and illness and wars and suffering and famine. After that complete collapse, a new heaven and a new earth is born, symbolized by a city. And this is what we're seeing happening now. New kinds of cities are being created, new kinds of global communities. And when you read the Book of Revelation carefully, you'll see that the description of the heavenly city forms an image of the philosopher's stone. The heavenly city is a cube, length, width, and height are all equal. It sits on a platform of 12 gemstones, and it's got a pearl above each of the gateways on the 4 sides. So it's literally an image of the philosopher's stone. This is Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece with the famous fountain. And to conclude with the stone and alchemy, this is Albrecht Durer's Melancholy. Famous engraving with an image of the philosopher's stone is this complex polyhedron to the left, representing the climax of the alchemical work. And then in our course, hypothetically, we could read Thomas Mann's great novel, Dr. Faustus, in which the composer composes an oratorio based on the apocalypse and is very involved in alchemy. And Mon's family chose a stone very close to a cube for his gravesite, which is in Kirchberg, across the lake from Kusnacht, where Jung is buried. And both Mon and Jung, of course, were preoccupied by the symbolism of alchemy, and in Thomas Mann's case, also with the mythology of apocalypse, which he wrote during the Second World War, and actually finished right down the road from here in Pacific Palisades near Los Angeles. So at this point, I'm going to stop the program. There's a lot more that we could do. And I'm going to turn to Rika, who will negotiate any questions that you all might have about the material that I presented, or about the myth program, Pacifica in general, anything you'd like us to try to address in the few minutes that we have left.
Great, thank you, Dr. Lansing Smith, and that was an absolutely beautiful presentation, and I hope you all have your takeaways and your questions. So our Q&A box is now open, so please type in your questions there. Again, as Dr. Lansing Smith said, please feel free to ask questions about the material that was presented, as well as about the Mythological Studies program itself. Okay. So as we are waiting for these questions, I would like to let everyone know that we are still accepting applications for fall 2020 for our Mythological Studies program. And the way the application process goes is, all you have to do is when you go to our website, immediately at the very front page, there is a bar that says apply now, and it's going to take you about 4 to 5 minutes to just quickly fill out that application form. And you do not have to submit all of the documents right then and there, just the application form. So what that means is, once we receive those forms, we will be contacting you. Our admissions advisors will be contacting you to walk you through the process, step by step, collecting the documents for you. And then once that is complete, your files will be given for file review, and then we will review that and give you a decision as to whether we will be inviting you for an interview. All right. So we have a first question here, and it says here for Dr. Lansing Smith: is there any research on the American shining city upon the hill and the alchemical apocalypse?
I'm not sure which shining on the hill you're referring to. Rika, is there a way for them to see me as I'm answering the questions?
Yes.
Yeah,
we can see it here. Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
My connection to the apocalypse in American culture is Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, which one of my first articles from way back when was on the apocalypse in The Scarlet Letter. And as you can imagine, it was a very important myth in the middle of the 19th century, as it is today for American culture. And the basic idea behind that is that the letter A on Scarlet's breast does not mean just adulteress. It also means alchemist, it means apocalypse. And this was a widely disseminated mythology of the mid-19th century spiritual crisis in America. So I'm not sure about the shining city on the hill. It would be something I'd love to pursue with you at some other point. Oh, John Winthrop. Well, then, of course, you know, Hawthorne would know about John Winthrop, right? And, you know, be coming from New England. And the whole mythology of the apocalypse in American history was this sense of the search for the new Adam, the new world, the new earthly paradise, the new city, the heavenly city that would emerge after the collapse of the monarchy and the corruption of English aristocratic government. So that the apocalypse does have a kind of revolutionary side to it, where there's an overthrow of a tyrannical power of some kind that leads to the creation of a new world, a new city. And Hawthorne was very involved with that. It was a spiritual movement called the Second Great Awakening that was engaging the apocalypse at that time. Thank you, Laurel.
Excellent. Thank you, Laurel. We still have time for a few more questions regarding the program. Okay. Dr. Lansing Smith, we have one here from Jason. Edward Edinger has written on the archetype of the apocalypse and discussed that he sees the apocalypse as a Jungian archetype that reveals the self coming into conscious realization of itself. Do you see this as an alchemical process?
Well, first of all, let me welcome Jason to the conversation. He's a current student. I'm delighted to see you here. And yes, it's very clear that in Jung's writings on alchemy, the big books, Mysterium Conjunctionis, Alchemy, Psychology of the Transference, that he definitely saw the alchemical process as what you might call a myth of analysis, where there's a disintegration of the psyche, a collapse of the ego that opens up to the deeper energies of the archetypal unconscious. And then a new self is born, a new sense of identity with a greater connection between the ego and the self. And this is essential to Jung. And absolutely, yes, an alchemical process. And Edinger still is one of my favorite writers on Jung, because he brings into the conversation alchemy, biblical references, lots of comparative mythology, all related to the psychological dynamics of personal growth and transformation. So thank you, Jason, for that really good point that you've made.
Excellent. Dr. Lansing Smith, this is not a part of the presentation, but perhaps for our audience, what would be, with regard to the Mythological Studies program, what would you say are ideal candidates for this program, and what sort of career trajectories will they be moving towards after this program?
Well, I'll start with the second part first. And there are so many different things that people do coming out of the Mythological Studies program that we have there's a slide on the website for the Myth program that shows you the wide range of things that people do coming out of the program. And it's a challenge because it does not lead directly to a clear career path as it would if you're coming out of the counseling psychology program, for example. You would pretty much know you're going to go into therapy, be a therapist, counselor, and so forth. But with Myth, it can certainly be a therapist, a pastoral counselor, a teacher, an educator, but also graphic artists, comic books and graphic films, composers who've written folk songs for their dissertations, poets, corporate executives I've had in my class on many occasions, including the day when the 2008 crisis hit. I had a guy in the class going back and forth to his cell phone all day long. And people out of the military. I had a student who was a good friend of Condoleezza Rice. So there are all kinds of things that people do. And, any good BA degree that includes a liberal arts component, with art history and literature and philosophy and Western Civ, American history, and of course, includes freshman English composition. It's good to be able to write when you're going into graduate school, and it's good to be able to read, and it's good to have a background in both areas. So I hesitate to portray any ideal student because we get people, as Rika knows very well, coming in from so many different backgrounds that I don't want to limit the possibilities so that you get discouraged, let's say, because you don't have a substantial focus on one of the humanities in your transcript. So I'll leave it at that. The less said, the better.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Lansing Smith. Absolutely. From the admission standpoint, we certainly get a lot of candidates from very different backgrounds. So please look into our programs, and this would certainly be something, again, like Dr. Lansing Smith said, could lead to all different kinds of career paths. It's 3:58. I just want to thank you all again for coming and joining us today. Also, from the admission standpoint, for those of you that have attended today, we are waiving the $75 application fee. So do apply the soonest, and that's available for you on the landing page. And I turn it over again to Dr. Lansing Smith for closing.
Okay, well, it's great to have you all here, and it's a time when we need our grounding in myth to orient ourselves to the new world that's being created. And Alchemy and Apocalypse and the study of myth, I think, can be very, very helpful for all of us on a personal level, but also collectively, when we really have, or what we're seeing really is a new mythology being born. And it's a painful birth, of course, but the study of myth and the humanities will be very important for whatever world emerges from the ashes of the one that's being destroyed. So I look forward to seeing you all, and stay happy and healthy, and keep reading, you know, and I hope to see you in the fall in the classroom.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Lansing Smith, and thank you, everybody. And we will see you at our next webinar. Do stay tuned for more events, and you can see that at admissions events on our Pacifica webpage. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of the day. Bye.
Bye-bye.